Okay, welcome. This video is going to look at economic growth. This is one of our economic issues for the HSC Economics course. This in particular, we're going to look at these four lesson objectives. So we'll look at what are the causes of economic growth, how they can come from both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We'll identify the effects of growth. They're pretty straightforward. And we're going to link the causes of growth, either aggregate demand or aggregate supply, to the policies to manage growth, because we'll see they link up pretty well. I'll move through some of these parts pretty quick, so just pause the slides if you need to. Pause the video on a slide if you need to. We also need to recall what our definition of economic growth is, and we need to really remember these two formulas because they like to ask questions using those. So from the syllabus, these are the parts that we're referring to. So aggregate demand and its components. Notice that we'll also see why this is a Y here for national income or aggregate supply instead of the AD, because they're both equal to each other. Aggregate demand at equilibrium will equal aggregate supply. There are components. We also know we have injections and withdrawals from year 11. IG and X are equal to ST and M at equilibrium. And if we have more injections, we'll have greater growth. We'll look at the causes or the sources and effects of economic growth in Australia and increases in aggregate supply, so how that can come through improvements in efficiency and technology. So these are the two main parts, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, our main sources of growth. Aggregate demand being AD and the total demand for goods and services in the economy. So the total amount of stuff that's going to be purchased by the consumers or in businesses or the government, and those are our components there. We take away imports, whereas the rest are all added up together. So consumption, investment, government expenditure, and exports minus imports. Aggregate supply is also referred to as Y, or national income. This is the total productive capacity of an economy. So the total level of supply in the economy and the total level of demand in the economy. So how much stuff we can actually make and how much stuff we're willing to buy and able to buy. So the components of aggregate supply are consumption plus savings plus taxation, because out of your income, you're going to get taxed some, you'll spend some, and the rest will be your savings. So we see this equilibrium formula in the textbook. I'll just quickly make some sense of it. This is from our 5-sector circular flow of income from year 11, households and firms, the financial sector, government sector, and overseas sector. And we've got leakages, which are ST and M. Leakages are bad. They're going to reduce economic growth. We want injections for economic growth. These are good. We want investment, we want the government to spend money, and we want to sell exports. So this is that formula. Aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand at equilibrium. We'll see that on a graph in a couple of slides. So Y equals AD. If we swap in the components of AD, Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Get sick of saying that. That's from that first slide where we just saw the syllabus. We saw that same formula. So if we swap in C plus S plus T, that's going to equal CIG and X minus M. Consumption is on both sides here. So we can take consumption away from both sides. We can move imports to the other side. Oh, sorry. And that's going to give us STM equals IGX. So we can see how there's a link between leakages and injections and aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So at equilibrium, leakages will equal injections. But if we have more injections than leakages, we're going to have economic growth. And we can see that can come from aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We can analyze these fluctuations, these changes in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, by using this graph here. So we've graphed the quantity, so the total quantity in the economy, and the general price level in the economy. So this could be general price level, this can be output. Aggregate demand meaning the total level of demand added up, in aggregate, and supply, the total level of supply. So it's similar to our normal demand and supply diagram, but at equilibrium, this is going to give us our output. Our quantity is going to be GDP in the economy, and the price equilibrium, or PE, is going to be the general price level. So this is going to be our level inflation. This is our average level of prices. So what we want is output here. We want to increase output. We want to increase this quantity and shift to the right. So we can either shift aggregate demand to the right, the total demand of individuals, businesses, and the government, or we can shift aggregate supply to the right and the total amount of production capacity that businesses have. So either of these curves shifting to the right will increase our output and increase GDP. However, they're going to have different impacts on the price level when we shift those curves, and we'll see that in a moment. This is a really helpful graph from the RBA. It shows how our different components of aggregate demand contribute to GDP growth. So we can see there's consumption, investment is pushed together into three different categories here. Government, exports, and then we take away imports. So we can see how they all add up to GDP growth. So how can aggregate demand increase? Well, it can increase from any of its components increasing. So if consumption increases, this is normally our biggest. This is about 50 to 60% of our aggregate demand is consumption. If consumption increases, so if people's average propensity to consume increases, if their APC increases, they have a greater propensity to consume, they'll buy more things. If C goes up, aggregate demand goes up. If businesses invest more, I goes up, then AD goes up. If the government spends more money, or if we sell exports, though any increase of the components would increase aggregate demand. That would increase GDP. We know that that would also reduce unemployment in the economy, which is good, but it will usually increase inflationary pressures. It will drive prices up, which is bad. So what happens if we sell more exports? And we'll see that on the graph in the model. If we increase exports, we're increasing aggregate demand, assuming everything else stays the same. And we can see that on this model here. So we've got output and general price level on our axes. As a result of increased exports, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and GDP increases. So we've got aggregate demand here initially. We increase our level of exports, so aggregate demand is going to shift up and to the right. We're going to increase the level of GDP, but we're also going to see prices rise. So we'll see an increase in inflation, so increased production of goods and services. So that's a model to show how economic growth occurs from aggregate demand. So next is aggregate supply. Notice the syllabus doesn't focus on the components of supply, just aggregate demand. Aggregate supply can be increased when a higher level of output can be produced for the same cost. So usually from an increase in improvement in the quality of factors of production, such as our land, labor, capital, or enterprise. So notice these are all supply side. They relate to production by businesses. So businesses are getting more efficient. They're improving their use of technology or the technology they have to use. So anything that's going to improve their productivity might lower costs for them. It will drive up aggregate supply. So aggregate supply can come from population growth. There's more people, there's more workers. Discovery of new resources, so there's more stuff to use to produce goods and services. There's workers acquiring new skills, so education and stuff like that. There increased capital, adoption of new technology, measures to improve efficiency, and then lastly, I think it's maybe cut off in my face here, government policy. So government policies like microeconomic reform can improve aggregate supply. So think business. We've got a picture of some people working efficiently here. That will increase aggregate supply. Pretty quickly, we're just going to identify the effects of economic growth. They're pretty straightforward. We know it's our most important objective. We know we aim to 3 to 4% annual growth, and it has a flow-on effect to other objectives. If we achieve economic growth, it'll help us to achieve unemployment, stable prices, and stuff like that. So it's going to lower unemployment. That's good. It's going to improve our higher living standards. That's good. It seems to be outweighed by all these 4 red negatives, but these 2 are really important, these 2 positive effects. So we can't understate those. It's also going to lead to price increases and higher inflation from economic growth. It can worsen external stability because if we have more money, we'll buy more imports. It can worsen income inequality because some of the benefits and the benefits of economic growth might flow more to the wealthier. The economic growth can also worsen environmental sustainability. We maybe deplete more resources or we cause more pollution and negative externalities. Lastly, macroeconomic policy. So this is how the government can manage economic growth. They can use macro or micro. Macroeconomic policies will influence aggregate demand. They'll increase it or decrease it. If we focus on just improving economic growth, expanding the economy, we want to increase aggregate demand. We can do that through fiscal policy. They can cut taxes or increase spending, or monetary policy, cut the cash rate and lower interest rates so people spend more money. That will increase consumption. It will increase aggregate demand. This is known as demand side economics, has its pros and cons. These policies are faster to implement and have an impact, so there's a shorter time lag there. However, raising aggregate demand is generally a short-term solution. It's a short-term management, and it will increase inflationary pressures. So on the other hand, we can use micro. It, again, has its own pros and cons. It aims to increase aggregate supply. So we're looking at the other part of the diagram. This will achieve higher GDP, so that it could be policies such as trade liberalization, labor market deregulation, investment in workforce skills, and financial deregulation. These are some examples of key microeconomic reforms. These are also known as supply-side economics. So they will typically have adverse GDP consequences in the short term, as you can see in this J-curve. They're not very popular. They kind of make things worse in the short term. However, they mean there's far more potential in the longer term if we increase aggregate supply. We want aggregate supply to increase as well as aggregate demand to increase. So there's potential for ongoing growth. So they have adverse consequences in the short term, although they'll have a positive impact on GDP and economic growth over a 10 to 20 year period. But who's generally thinking over 10 to 20 years? Normally we're thinking of the next kind of political cycle and getting voted back in. So these can be unpopular because they take a long time to have an effect. But they're really important macroeconomic reforms. We can also see what the business cycle looks like. The blue here is the business cycle with no policy. So we're not using any macroeconomic policy to smooth out the business cycle. We're going to have bigger ups, bigger downs. Here in the red, we start to use some macroeconomic policy to counter and smooth out the business cycle. So we can see the line is a little bit more stable. We've got less large fluctuations in the curve. And then if we use macro and micro, we can see that we'll have a J-curve effect. It might get worse in the short term, but in the longer term, over time, we have potential for greater GDP growth. So we've explained the causes. We've looked at how growth can come from aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We quickly went through the effects of growth, and then we've linked the policies to either the aggregate demand or aggregate supply, macro or micro. Thank you.